Hello, I'm Vicki Hogarth and welcome to Southwest Magazine. Today's guest, St. Croix MLA Greg Thompson, served as the Minister of Veteran Affairs for Canada from 2006 to 2010. He joined me in the CHCO studio just before Remembrance Day to reflect on Canada's military history and current role in world affairs. Do you think, in terms of Canada's history, because we're such a big country and we're such a young country, we're such a spread out country, and we have such a confusing history with the Queen involved and whatnot, do you think there's something that Canadians all think about in a sort of unified way in terms of what our military stands for and fights for?
Well, I do. I mean, we have, one of the best, military, best military in the world. I mean, it's like our soldiers are disciplined, they're well trained, and so in the eyes of many countries, we're great soldiers, and we've proven it in all these conflicts. And World War I, World War II, Korea, Afghanistan, and so yeah, we have a great military tradition in this country. And if you look at the number of people that served in World War I and World War II, a relatively small country. I think in World War I we only had about 8 million people in Canada, and we had a big contribution in World War I. Had a number of soldiers that served overseas and fought at Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele, and some of the most troublesome spots in that war. And we achieved, that, and say we really fought out of our weight class, if you will, and small country, big contribution, and it's remembered worldwide and what we were able to achieve. Same in World War II. Mm-hmm. Canadian soldiers are always considered the best by other countries.
I've heard people say, though, that if it wasn't for the U.S. being beside us, we wouldn't be able to defend our borders. But what do you think the strength of the Canadian military is in terms of its role in the world internationally in making change or deciding what to fight for or what not to fight for even?
Yeah, well, we're part of NORAD, and the U.S. is a big partner in NORAD, as you well know, but we have the European nations all part of that as well, so we're a big contributor to NORAD, but there's no question that the strength of the United States is phenomenal. I mean, the technology they have, dwarfs pretty well every other country in the world, and they're still building planes, and they're still looking at all kinds of options to be stronger. It's always been part of what they are, and so we have an alliance with them, and it's a strong one, it's a good one, and I guess we depend on each other. So, yeah.
With so many World War II vets, though, dissipating in terms of the numbers, how can we remember their stories? What do you think is the best way going forward to take from the two world wars something from the people that are still here, but maybe not for much longer?
Veterans Affairs do a good job at making sure we have those stories, that they're recorded and they're there for future generations to hear and learn from, listen to. I'll give you an example of that. When I became Minister of Veterans Affairs, I was getting ready to do my speech in the House of Commons. It's one of those rare moments where the Veterans Affairs Minister probably has the best opportunity in the entire House of Commons to give a speech. So there's no heckling, it's dead silence, people listen, they're interested in it, and it's a great opportunity. So I took a lot of care in the preparation of those speeches and the delivery of those speeches. It's very rewarding when it happens. But and the lead up to that, I was working on some ideas for my speech, and my son was telling about his grandfather, my father-in-law, that served in World War II. He is an American soldier, and he grew up in the state of Maine and landed in Normandy on D-Day. And my son told me this story of how he survived that. And all you have to do is envision the Saving Private Ryan story, which I think just what everyone in North America, the world, has watched. I mean, it's an incredible movie and very realistic in a lot of ways. But when those sea craft, I'm trying to think of it, landed on the beach, and the front end of the boat goes down. I'm trying to think of the right name for that craft, but anyway, the soldiers coming down off of that and just being mowed down, as you well know. I mean, it was just, they're setting ducks for the Germans. And my father-in-law was on that, on one of those landing craft. That's the term I'm looking for. And it was like pure suicide. You just say, well, I don't know if I could do that. I mean, like, you're running out and you say, well, how are you going to survive that? Because the Germans are up on the hill just picking them off. And that's all depicted in that movie, Saving Private Ryan. And so my father-in-law, their craft was hit, and he and another guy, they made a deliberate choice to go over on the left-hand side of the craft as opposed to the right-hand side. They went over where the craft was kind of damaged and blown apart, which they didn't want them to do that because they could rip their clothing or get caught up in it. But he said it's my only chance of survival. So he got in the water, and just like you'd see again on the movie. And he actually made it to the sandy beach, and they were just shooting them as they were moving. So he laid there. He laid there for hours and just creeping by inches, and it took him until late that evening to actually reach the shore. He survived it. You just can't believe that he survived it. And so my son was telling me that story, and I said, well, how'd you know that story? I didn't know that story. Well, he said, well, Granddad's only told it to 2 people. But he said, I guess you have to ask them, And so that was, it's a remarkable story of survival. And then he talked about how he survived once he got up into what they call the hedge country, and family taking him in and feeding him, and just taking care of him for a number of days, because he had survived also like an explosion that basically blew his eardrums out of him. It was just unbelievable that he survived any of this, but he did. And when you're watching that movie, it's such a powerful movie. I mean, we get all teared up when we watch that movie, because you just think of your own loved ones and what they went through. But there's people in this community that did the same thing when they landed at Juneau Beach. But see, we don't know some of those stories, but because we didn't ask. And most of the men and women that served in the armed forces don't want to tell those stories, because they're horrific stories, and they bring back powerful memories that are very difficult for them to talk about. So unless you take the time to talk to them, they're probably not going to tell you. And that was the case with myself. So I learned a lot in that conversation with my son. So I incorporated that into my speech. It basically wasn't a dry eye in the House of Commons that day when I gave that speech. It was a detailed speech, but it went through some of the sacrifices of the men and women that particular day. So, but anyway, the sacrifices that just ordinary people made, it's just truly unbelievable. And you ask yourself, well, could I do that? That's a question that, I said, man, I don't know if I could or not. But many of them did, and very few refused to do it. They're very dedicated to the mission, and they knew there's a lot at stake, and they put themselves at risk so that we can, live in the best country in the world. So,
I was talking to a friend of mine this week who's 79, and she wasn't in the military, but she was a little girl in Belgium during World War II. And I was talking about doing this interview, and so she told me her memories of when the Germans came through, which was something I didn't know about her at all. And I was like, how did you not tell me this over the years we've known each other? And she said, well, the thing is, when you have those memories, you don't always want to share them.
No.
And I wonder, from your experience being the Minister of Veterans Affairs, what was illuminated by the veterans to you about their experience and what it was like trying to reintegrate?
Well, some of it was very difficult. I mean, because of post-traumatic distress, and what they call it, shell shock, and they have various names for it. But I mean, that was present then, And a lot of those men came home and just suffered in silence. I mean, they didn't want to talk about it, and they didn't. And I mean, of course, I grew up with those kind of families. I was born in 1947, so you know, you grew up with just about every family. Their father had served in the armed forces in some capacity, and some of those you know, kids were growing up in those some of the households where the father was truly suffering from that. And but there's no one talked about it. Very difficult for them to talk about it.
You did make the Bill of Rights, though, for veterans in 2007.
Yes.
What was the reason behind that, and what you were trying to accomplish?
Well, once you you know, once we sort of get inside the, you know, the Veterans Affairs, you can see there's a lot of veterans who are missing the benefits that they're entitled to. And there's a lot of veterans that they just didn't apply for benefits, and they get kind of pushed off by the bureaucracy and so on and so forth. In fact, there's one, I can still remember this because a couple of Liberal MPs came to see me on an issue that they've been dealing with for years, and the members of Parliament before them had been dealing with it. It actually goes back to Pierre Trudeau, you know, the present Prime Minister's father. It goes back to 1967, 68 in that era where it's like bureaucracy putting them off, and it's like, you know, it was a real problem and had to be fixed. But they had no kind of recourse. I mean, they basically had to have a minister that took an interest in it. They took an interest in it, we got it fixed. I mean, that was like a 40-year ordeal for that family. And say, well, we got to do something, you know, have something better than that, but they have to have some kind of a reassurance that the government's listening. That was kind of like the reasoning behind the Bill of Rights for Veterans, and we unveiled that in Kitchener. You're right, it was 2007. So the Prime Minister and I went up to Kitchener, unveiled it. It was very popular with the veterans, and it's displayed in many of the Legion halls. You go in, you'll see that little Bill of Rights. So it did make a difference, but it just gives them the confidence that, you know, we have a government that's interested in our well-being, and, you know, here it is on paper. This is what I'm entitled to, and which they are.
Is it still a work in progress? Are there a lot of things you think that could be better or need to be sort of monitored over time and changed as we progress and understand things like PTSD better?
Well, anything that has to do with government can always be better because it's a huge bureaucracy, and even on our watch there's things that, you know, will slip by, and you've got to go back and fix them, or just be a little more vigilant in how you deal with it. But you're dealing with human beings, and I mean, you know, people make mistakes. You know, some of the administrators within the department and officials make mistakes, and sometimes they're conditioned to making those mistakes over and over again. It sounds, I mean, when you talk about services to veterans, but the problem with the veterans, well, I was back up a little bit. The Prime Minister asked me one day, oh, who is, you know, what is a veteran, Greg? You know, who is a veteran? You know, what, you know? But I said, well, in Canada, there's at least 15 different categories of veterans, depending on where you served and what theater of war you were in, or, you know, all of those things. So they have different categories of veterans, and every one of those categories is entitled to certain benefits. Some are not entitled to benefits that the other guy living across the road is. So it's very confusing, and that's got somehow has to be addressed, and we sort of address it incrementally. But you can't fix it all at once. And I think the department is still grappling with this, how best to do it. But it is a huge bureaucracy.
Are there veterans involved in that process, giving their point of view? And
yeah, they are. Yeah, they are involved, and they, you know, often give us advice, and sometimes they give us the devil for not being as, you know, as vigilant or as receptive to change as we should be. But I think we did a pretty good job on the whole, and I think the present minister is doing a pretty good job on the whole. But there's always will be issues, especially when you're delivering a service as complicated as that. So if it was like one category of veterans and one category only, the world, you know, the veterans would be better off. We'd all be better off because you wouldn't get into those types of situations. And unfortunately, there's all these different categories, and they're all entitled to something, but they're not all entitled to the same thing. And so you get into that in nursing home care and some of the other issues, and home support services, and some of the other benefits go to the veterans community.
Do you think Canada is a particularly hard country to maybe serve for veterans just because of our size, because we're so spread out? Because maybe when you were in the military, you were stationed in Victoria and then in St. John.
Yeah, well, what we have across the country, and we have the veterans services available just about everywhere in the country, and some of them are little satellite offices, and we have people who will travel to to engage with veterans within the department, and they do a good job. There's no question about that. But there's big challenges for them in terms of what kind of a service can we provide for some of these aging veterans? Because again, some of these aging veterans, you could have one gentleman on one side of the street, one on the other, and they're entitled to different services, and it's hard to explain that. I mean, it's almost impossible to justify it, but that's how it's written. So that's a big challenge for Veterans Affairs to get that right.
Do you think the next generation of armed forces are more open to talking about what they're going through and maybe not being as prone to things like suicide after they've retired?
Well, it seems that the modern day veterans are faced more with those types of issues. I mean, I did go to Afghanistan, and we did a sort of a tour of Afghanistan, and we're on the sort of the right up with the soldiers on the firing line, if you will. And so that was really insightful. But you can just understand, like when you're with these men and women, just how stressful it is, because the enemy is different than it's, say, in World War II. And you've seen some of these movies where it's true. You don't know if they're friend or foe, and they go through all these heart-wrenching, episodes of, do I shoot or do I not? And, like it's just a whole lot of issues that really play hard on their minds. And I think it's, and the consequence of that, I think a lot of them are coming home that, that have been wounded mentally as a result of that. There's no question about it, more so than, say, World War I or World War II. But back then, I mean, we don't know for sure because they didn't talk about it. But now it's more, they talk about it more openly than they did in the past. I mean, it's, but like even in our greater society, we don't talk about mental illness. If you break your arm, it's okay, you talk about it. But if you got a broken spirit, can't do that. People will think I'm, So it's just it's a mindset that we have to get over as Canadians, as just as individuals, as human beings, and say, listen, they're injured, they need help, and we got to be there to help them through this. So some of the programs that Veterans Affairs have for some of the modern day veterans, if you will, they're good programs, and they're learning as they go, because there's a lot of challenges there, but they've invested a lot of time and money and expertise into it, so I think it's paying dividends. I think the country that, and this is kind of going back to where you're leading with that question originally, but Canada is probably has the best programs in the world. I mean, we're always rated as the best, and if we are in second place, it would be Australia. It would be the only country that's kind of leading the pack, if you will, or maybe slightly ahead of us in how they treat their veterans and the programs they have. So the two top countries in the world are Canada and Australia. And in the United States, Veterans Affairs is really plagued by monumental problems. I mean, huge problems. Because in my generation, every young man served. So like everyone my age, anyone growing up after World War II were drafted into there. I mean, everyone served. And so it's a huge veterans population. And then through the Vietnam War and so on, I mean, they have a lot of homeless veterans. I mean, hundreds of thousands of homeless veterans. And suicide rates, I think that's like, it's, I don't want to quote the figure, but the number of suicides in the veterans population in the United States is a phenomenal, number. And homeless and, just really broken men and women that, no place to go, no place to live. And a lot of them are living on the streets. So in Canada, you don't see that. We had a program for homeless veterans in Canada. And we had a lot of major corporations step up and help us and to identify them. But we have the programs there for them, and there's not a lot of them. But again, the ones that are there, that are on the street, again, it's because of the post-traumatic stress disorder. So they're, you know, they're suffering and they need help, and you have to reach out to, you know, bring them into the system, because they, you know, they just tend not to want to come in themselves. So we've worked pretty hard at that. And I'm saying we, but I mean the present government is working hard at it as well. So it's something that we've avoided, that the United States, I think, because the sheer numbers are overwhelmed by just the statistical evidence of how many are on the streets. I think at one time they're saying there's, like in Philadelphia alone, there's 40,000 homeless veterans. Wow. I mean, numbers that you can't even get your head around.
Did you find, being from this area where we're so close to the border, with your generation, that your contemporaries in Calais, like, do you share stories? Do they have generally like a different experience of their generation than you do?
No, because I grew up in that generation, and yeah, because a lot of those young men went to Vietnam, and obviously a lot of them didn't come back, and a lot of them come back, you know, not in the best of health mentally or physically. So I mean that took a big toll on some of these small towns and across the country. There's no question about that. Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of casualties.
So you knew Tim too?
I did, yeah. I didn't know him as well as my wife, because my wife grew up in Calais, and I met Tim Jewett, but I didn't know him as well as because, you know, like, that was the generation that my wife grew up with. Yeah. So there's a lot of young men over there that served in Vietnam, and that was a really, let's say, ugly war. You know, it's just horrible. And so again, we've seen so many movies. I mean, movies don't tell the whole story, but and just over the years, we're reading about what went on and how difficult it was, the conditions that they were, you know, fighting under. Just truly, you just wonder how they get through it day to day.
Yeah, and then to come back and maybe feel like you're in a war that people didn't agree with too. I can't imagine feeling like you're also on the wrong side of history after everything you lived through.
I know, because if you remember, the Vietnam veterans came home. I mean, they're fighting for their country, and you know, the nation was divided on it, and you know, like, it's the first war ever that they were, you know, sort of booed off the streets and you know, basically humiliated for serving their country. I mean, like, you know, they were drafted. They had no choice to go. You know, they might not have agreed with it, but they did what their country asked them to do, and come home wanting to be, you know, humiliated by their own people, which is, you know, real sad testimony. And I think, you know, America kind of get over that, if you will. And you know, a lot of mistakes were made by some of the young protesters and others. I mean, like, when you're young, you're very idealistic, and you know, you believe in something. But I think a lot of those young men were punished unnecessarily as a result of that.
Do you think there's been growing skepticism since then, maybe in North America, when it comes to war? Do we always sort of think we're fighting for the right things? Do you think the youth today maybe are more hesitant to believe we're going in for the right reasons, or?
Well, I mean, if you take a look at, I mean, our latest, you know, like, you know, what's going on in the Middle East and Canada's contribution there, I mean, that was always, you know, controversial. So, you know, what, you know, are we going to make a difference? Can we make a difference? And it was, you know, in Afghanistan, for example, it was, you know, we're going to basically remake the country, but you know, you could argue that the I think it's 245 young Canadians died there. You know, so we don't want them to have died in vain. I mean, I guess the world hasn't given up on Afghanistan, but those are really troubled nations, and you wonder if the sacrifices all work. And I mean, that's one of the, you know, controversies out there now, and it was present when we were over there, when these young men and women were serving.
Do you think, besides the sacrifices we made, we should also remember maybe the things we shouldn't have been involved with, some of the mistakes we've made as a country? And if so, what are they?
Well, I'm not sure, you know, like, you know, I guess all wars are, you know, so you could argue maybe they're unnecessary. I mean, but some of them, I think that, you know, you take World War II, for example. I mean, I don't think the world had a choice, you know. and some of those others, like, you know, where you're talking about the Middle East, I mean, it's a deliberate choice by governments whether we go in and help or we set back and let somebody else do it. I mean, our intentions are always good over there, and and we paid, you know, a lot of our young people paid the ultimate sacrifice. But you look back, say, well, what's going on in Afghanistan today? Was it worth it? You know, should we have gone? I mean, it's like, you know, sort of 20/20 hindsight, I suppose. But we have made a difference in the lives of a lot of young men and women over there. There's no question about that. But whether the country can advance on its own and get beyond where it presently is, I suppose it's debatable.
What do you think still draws Canadians to become part of the military today?
I think it's just the idea that you know, there's some, you know, we have, Canada's been known as like peacekeepers. I mean, we, you know, since World War I. I mean, that was sort of like where we've sort of established ourselves as the peacekeepers of the world. So, you know, we've been on some very noble missions, and the outcomes have been very good, and we did a heck of a job, if you will. And so I think there's the idea that I'm serving my country. We're doing something good for some of the most troubled spots in the world, and I think a lot of that drives young men to say, yeah, it's, you know, and of course the adventure. I mean, it's you know, it's all part of, I guess, when you're at that particular age. There's you know, they're sort of, I guess, influenced by a lot of those different kind of factors. It's an exciting way of life. We're doing something good for other nations in the world, so a whole lot of reasons why I might want to join. And so, again, we have the best soldiers in the world, so we have to believe that, you know, hopefully that'll never end, if you will, in the sense of people that are willing to step up and serve their country.
What do you think are the Canadian values that drive our military and drive people to join it? What do you think people stand for when they join the military as a Canadian?
Well, I think it's, I mean, I do know that we take, you know, our way of life for granted. I think, you know, that's in terms of freedoms that we have, and you're saying, well, you know, we're one of the most blessed countries in the world, and I think that's, you know, sort of a conscious part of decision making by young men when they join, you know, like, here's a troubled spot in the world, and, you know, hopefully I'll get to serve, and hopefully we'll be able to make a difference. So maybe some of the same thoughts that went through the minds of our young people in World War I, World War II. You know, there's always men and women willing to serve, thank goodness.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you. Probably see each other on Remembrance Day.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO-TV, New Brunswick's only source for independent community television.